we really wanted to try to bring something together before this was old news or things had changed so much that we didn't even recognize the origins anymore. And we were very lucky to have enough people here in the Chicago community that we could bring two really excellent speakers and all of you together to really try to just about what is happening in Chile right now, what it means, and what it will mean going forward. Now, as most of you probably know, the current cycle of events in Chile began sometime around the 19th of October with a series of protests about fare hikes. It's very similar to the 2013 circumstances in Brazil that some of you might be familiar with. But very quickly, it has escalated to something that is much larger, both in the Chilean context and in the rest of the world. For those of you that follow the Latin American region, obviously, you have probably thought about how this is connected to what's happened in Ecuador most recently, but also in Brazil from 2015 forward, in Argentina from the very first decades of this century forward, and in many other places. This is a wave of protest that's not just about immediate issues, but also about whether or not both democracies and neoliberal orders are able to effectively confront the challenges of the 21st century. Things like inequality, things like insecurity, the concentration of power and resources among the few, issues of corruption, both invented and real, and the closing opportunities, the inability of national states to deal with issues of migration and globalization, the distrust of all kinds of organizations, and the inadequacies of both authoritarian and democratic structures. All of these are things that are in the air in Chile and elsewhere. So we're really lucky today to have two people here to talk to us about these local manifestations in the Chilean context. Andreas Feldman, whose name is on our poster, is an associate professor of Latin American and it says Latino studies, I suppose now they're probably moving into Latinx studies, at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He was previously, between 2005 and 2014, a professor at the Catholic University of Chile, and he was also a postdoc here at the University of Chicago between 2003 and 2005 in the Human Rights Program. His PhD is in political science from Notre Dame, and his BA is in communication and journalism from the Universidad de Chile. And he is the author and co-author of 3 books and many, many articles about issues ranging from migration and globalization and human rights to armed conflict, security, and foreign policy, involving not just Chile, but also Haiti, Colombia, and Mexico, and many countries across Latin America. We're also lucky today, Andreas will speak for roughly 20 minutes, and then after that we're going to have a briefer commentary from one of our own, Natalia Niedmann Alvarez, who is here doing her PhD at the law school. She previously did a master's degree at the law school and also did her undergraduate studies in Chile. And one of the things that's most interesting about Natalia, among many, many interesting things, is that she was in the Central Coordinating Committee for the movement Marca tu Voto that was advocating for a constitutional assembly in Chile in 2013. And she also happens to have been in Chile these last few weeks and was actually present for many of the events that we'll be talking about today. And so she's going to briefly, after Andreas speaks, give us some sense of what this looks like from the perspective of constitutional law. There's been lots of talk about the need to finally do a full-scale renovation of the 1988 constitution that was written under the authoritarian regime, and so she'll bring a really different perspective to our discussions afterward. After the two of them speak, we're going to open the floor. We expect that many of you will have things to say, not just questions to ask, but have things that you wish to express. I will be very brutal about time limits so that we have time for as many people as possible to come into the discussion. But welcome to everybody, and we're really looking forward to getting all sorts of issues out in the air here at the University of Chicago, which is, of course, a very important place to be discussing the consequences of neoliberalism and the kind of democratization that has accompanied it over the last now nearly 40 years since the neoliberal experiments began. So thank you so much.
Well, let me start by thanking Brody and Natalie for this kind invitation. It's wonderful to have the time to
space in which both we and Natalia and myself reflect on this. It's nice that we represent like two different generations in Chile. Which means that I'm getting pretty old. Anyhow, so what I prepared is something very simple, and I think that many of you understand that rule. So this is basically the layout of the presentation. Just very briefly show what happened. Some conceptual sort of notes on the nature of the crisis. Discuss a little bit about some of the consequences, material and human, and then very briefly introduce some of the causes that have been presented as, trying to make sense of this very particular moment. I would discuss some future scenarios, and then Natalia will talk about the constitutional debate, which is very important when one reflects on what's to come. So, interestingly, this all started as a movement of civil disobedience. That's how it started, basically, as a result of students protesting the increase of subway fares in the Chilean, in Santiago's subway. And so, as you see, many students, thousands of them, were in a way disobeying and were basically evading and getting to the subway station, protesting, and sort of showing a show of force that was peaceful. The government was, in a way, outflanked and reacted in the way that normally governments react, which is deploying the police. And that's a comment I will make later. Unfortunately, the Chilean police wasn't reformed. And the way in which it handles protests normally is quite violent. But at the same time, protests in Chile have been, ever since we returned to democracy in 1990, very violent as well. There's a pattern of more multifaceted violence in which some elements of some protests are violent and the police is quite violent and never been reformed that way. So you see like the police trying to hold students from coming, and eventually that got out of control. As it always happened, unfortunately, in many of the protests. Police uses disproportionate force and things get out of hand. And at that time, what nobody expected was this. And the metro stations were, in the metro, many of you who are not Chilean or not living in Santiago, so the metro is a very symbolic place. It's sort of the pride and joy of Chile in general, Santiaguinos in particular, because it's not only a very modern and squeaky clean and very efficient way of transport, but it's also a system that unites Santiago from the very affluent neighborhoods to the more underserved communities. And it moves, I think, anywhere between 2.8 and 3 million people a day. It's very, very Chicago would never be having a metro like this one. In reality, it's a very sort of, so the fact that many stations were torched and attacked and vandalized is something we, to everyone, surpassed. But these are some of the images. And violence started spreading like wildfire. And at that point, the police started, again, trying to step up its repression. There were attacks on buses, etc. So the situation was very quickly out of control for the police. The police started to be overwhelmed. As if that wasn't enough, in many of the sort of different distant neighborhoods or underserviced neighborhoods, there were attacks on property. So these are those stations or toll booths that were attacked, probably later, but nonetheless, the fury, the rage of the people was just manifested in a different ways. And more importantly, probably, this is an image of Talca, which is a city 2,250 kilometers south of Santiago. The very sort of nice market was torched by an enraged group of people. So attacks on infrastructure, attacks on different sort of symbols, and totally out of control. And then the looting began. And the looting was massive, it spread very quickly, and it created sort of this condition in which basically, authorities were totally overwhelmed, didn't know what to do, where they basically try to protect critical infrastructures, where they try to protect, different sort of commerce from being vandalized and looted and all that. So anyhow, I wanted to basically show you some of the images, but we don't have time. So, very quickly, so protests escalated from civil disobedience and peaceful demonstrations to widespread violence, including arson, looting, something massive destruction. And it spread, and this is a really interesting thing, to the idea that it was premeditated. It spread, so this is a protest that originally started in Santiago. It spread in a matter of 12 or 16 hours to the rest of the country, in ways that nobody could have really predicted. So, in some ways, I think that, and I will come back to this idea of irony in a minute, the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is a humanitarian organization, has been, in a way, working with conditions of armed conflict, but it also works in what's called conditions of what it calls basically conditions of internal disturbances. And I underscore this because this is, from a conceptual point of view, something that helps us a lot. Chile was not in a situation of armed conflict, but of course it wasn't in a situation of peace either. So this is basically what we were looking at. Serious or lasting internal confrontation short of an armed conflict, which includes acts of violence from spontaneous isolated acts of revolt to a struggle by groups in various stages of organization. This is important. Various stages of organization. Some is basically inorganic, some is to some extent organized. I guess the authorities in power, the situations would not necessarily escalate into open struggle, but the authorities use large police forces and even the armed forces to restore order. This is exactly what happened. You can go to the website of the ICRC if you want to see it. They have been working on this. So I think this helps us out to try to understand what this was all about. I cannot go back. Okay, so this is the issue. What we saw in some of the neighborhoods in Santiago and in other cities, in Valparaíso and Concepcion, could be in a way described as this idea of, anomaly. So a situation in which the rules and norms that normally, in a way, create normal interactions in society break down. So the behavior becomes unconstrained. And standard notions of what is acceptable in a way break down. And that creates a lot of fear and anxiety for the population. You have to understand that, and I think Natalia can speak to that, and especially in the neighborhood where this is happening, especially in the neighborhood where metro station Foretold, La Florida, very sort of middle class neighborhood, which some of the images show just absolutely total discontrol. And the police was absolutely overwhelmed to try to do something about it. So, interestingly, and I want to make a point that I find particularly important. This is one aspect of, a layered aspect of what has been going on, because in addition to that, and the most substantive element is that there has been a widespread sort of movement of dissatisfaction in the population. 2 or 3 days after this happened, there was a huge manifestation, a huge sort of rally in Santiago, and most people sort of say it's anywhere between 1 and 1.2 million people who basically peacefully marched in Santiago. This is what's substantive. And I think Carla Rueral, who's the governor of Santiago, was, and now it's the press spokesperson for the administration, in a way, yesterday in an interview said quite pointedly, violence is important, but unfortunately, violence takes away our attention to what's really substantive and important, which is the massive, enormous sense of dissatisfaction on the part of the population. And that is showing by this sort of enormous rally that is for the most part. Of course, violence is an important enemy because it manifests, the sense of uneasiness that the society is feeling, the sense of marginalization of many communities and many youngsters. But the substantive element is this. So we have a layer of issues going on. On the one hand, this enormous sense of dissatisfaction, and then groups, either, and I will come to this in a second, either who violently protest, probably anti-systemic or anarchist groups that probably committed, some of the torching, and then you have this massive vandalizing and this massive looting in many underserviced communities that await to a different sort of pattern. Okay, so there was a colossal impact, or this has had a colossal impact. On the one hand, the human cost, 22 people killed, scores of people injured, 2,500, many with very severe eye injuries as a result of the way in which the police was shooting at them. It's called in Spanish balina, the exact translation. Interestingly, 650 state agents, in particular police, also wounded, which is something that needs to be taken into account. I had some images on some of the protests that were exceedingly violent. One instance in my pool, a group of, 150 people just attacking, flying. Police were in a van. And honestly, it was hard to see. 4,300 people arrested, and many complaints, 179 until now, of human rights abuses on the part of security forces, either the police or the military. This is going on, and probably at the Q&A, I'm going to talk a little about how to, in a way, reconcile this from a human rights perspective. There is basically a human rights perspective to this. I think that the idea that security forces are, using disproportionate force is something very disconcerting, but this is something that human rights organizations and other sort of institutions like the UN, the Universal Periodic Review, that in a way looks at the different human rights practices functions being, in a way, underscoring this in the case of Chile. Chile has a very sort of lingering problem with the way in which the police operate. The material costs have been enormous. I mean, I'm just putting some numbers here, but yesterday, for instance, authorities said that repairing the subway system is going to probably cost 380 million. That there were no insurances either for the stations or the trains for the tour. They never thought about something like that. They never, in a way, hired for any insurance. This is a very sort of telling element here as well. 25% of the supermarket chains and small supermarkets have been damaged, either looted, damaged, or totally destroyed. Huge amount. And when you talk to people in Santiago, there's not only the fact that many of them are closed down, but there's also this sense of uneasiness and fear that many don't want to open their stores because they might be looted. And we're not talking about enormous, great chains like Jumbo or Leader. We're talking about also many small shop owners whose shops were totally destroyed, and which are basically in a very difficult situation. The international image of the country suffered a lot. The suspensions two very important needs, private, the organization wanted to show the world how good Chile was doing, but unfortunately it wasn't the best of timing for them, so they had to cancel, which probably was the responsibility. So anyhow, I don't want to go into this too much because we don't have time, but several sort of different theories might explain this. The old and very sort of useful theory like Puerto of relative deprivation, which in a way looks at this sudden cluster of expectations following a period of rising hopes, which might lead to violence. And again, the idea of anomy that was developed by sociologists like Durkheim and Merton, which is again looking at this disjunction between aspirations and opportunities to realize those aspirations, and that leads to deviance for social accepted norms, which I think we are seeing some of this. And one element that I would like to talk about is the following. To the people who are basically mentioning that sorry. Anyhow, the point I'm trying to make is that in the 2010 earthquake, there was massive looting in many, places in big metropolis in Chile. So that's something that should have been taken into account. It's not that this was it's not that this really happened all of a sudden. There were indicators, it's just that we didn't probably look at this. And many elements that I think might explain, and it's great that Ben Lessing is here. Some of the elements that might be sort of informing at least part of the violence we are seeing, the looting especially, in particular, have to do with the fact that, unfortunately, unlike many other countries in the region, we are seeing parts of the Chilean metropolis that have been either abandoned by the state, or the state has been pushed out by different sort of actors, and in particular organized crime. So we have this concept about criminal governance, we have the concept by Alvarez about the gray zone. Some parts of Santiago really are dominated by this group. It's either narcos or the evangelical church that really takes, really has some sort of either control or either influence over the communities that they're living in. And that's part of the drama here, because many political parties, including the ones on the left, believe that they have traction in many of these communities, when in reality they don't have any traction. People in this community simply don't necessarily believe that they are sort of elements that might bring any change, that they don't believe in. So these are some pictures of children drawing, in some of these underserviced communities, and they speak for themselves. This is a project I'm doing with a colleague of mine called Pablo Luna in some of the sort of underserviced communities, and the influence, the impact that these groups are having on the life of these people is enormous. So the looting, this breakdown of the law, this sense of lawlessness. I mean, people are surprised now, but the ones who live there, of course, know that these are the rules. And we don't know exactly whether some of these groups stand on this, but there's clearly this sense that the old rules don't apply to these neighborhoods anymore. The looting is very emblematic about this. So these are images of the looting in the earthquake. It was quite massive, not to the extent that we saw now, but it was quite massive. So anyhow, let me sort of look at. Fortunately, Chileans don't lose their sense of humor. This is a wonderful one. I don't know if you understand. You didn't want to invest in mental health. Now run away, because we're all of us are discompensated. How do they say, like decompensados? I don't know how to say.
Decompensated.
Decompensated. What is
Decompensated.
Decompensated. So that's like. Because that this, in a way, talks about the fact that people just simply don't believe. The approval rate of President Piñera is 40%. So people don't believe in the targets that he put forward. And in many ways, what I find particularly problematic and telling is that probably the worst person of all to try to take Chile away, to try to in a way deal with this crisis is probably President Piñera. Because in many ways, he encapsulates what people are protesting against, but he doesn't realize that. So people were manifesting against his government and against his administration. Yeah, we also agree with this. We are in favor of this. They're protesting against the government. It's not that they are protesting against other sort of actors. It's against them, and it's against his administration. This is also wonderful. It's the thoughtful looter or vandal that say, "I'm sorry, mommy." And this is a wonderful one for the ones who like soccer. These arch rivals who come together, which is in and of itself something that Piñera should listen, because if people Colo-Colo and Lebu come together, there's something really wrong going on. Anyhow, what are the future scenarios? It's hard to say at this point. So I just mentioned a few that have been determined. So what would be the return to the ex-ante situation with incremental change? So more of the same. And that's probably what the government wants. Everything's going to be back to normal, and we're going to keep on living the way we do. A national dialogue seeking substantial reform, as well as in the discussion of through a National Assembly, looking at both, and that's something that Natalia is going to talk about, looking both at the Constitution and a new social pact. I think this is something that is developing right now. We don't know whether, and I'm not very optimistic that the government is going to be able to, in a way, keep in power, given the level of dissatisfaction that there exists. And the opposition has not also been willing to, in a way, join a government of national unity, which is probably what the situation warrants, because they're making their own calculations, unfortunately. So it's, politically speaking, this is something that is really very problematic in many ways. We could see like a steep decline leading to a period of very long term, decades along the lines of what we saw in Venezuela after '89. I think that what happened is very similar to the Caracas in 1989, it's not very different. And for the ones studying Venezuela, after that, Venezuela went, and what has happened in Venezuela in the last 20 years has to do with that. Chavez, in a way, was able to capture that sense of dissatisfaction. And finally, hopefully not, a period in which is going to lead to sort of authoritarianism of the sort of, you have the picture here, one leading to populist, what was Antonio Castro, his alter ego, Bolsonaro. Anyway, I'll leave it there, and thank you.
Natalia's embarrassment. Of course, my inner Brazilian imperialist was the one that said the 1988 Constitution. It is 1980, so she doesn't have it.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Variety and the Center for Latin American Studies for this presentation. I will try to keep my comments brief and circumscribe to the constitutional demands of the protest. The last Senate survey asked Chileans what were the most pressing issues the government should work on. The issues that received most mentions were health, pensions, and constitutional reform. Health was mentioned by 33% of those surveyed, pensions by 31%, and constitutional reform by 26%. In addition to that, 87% of those who were surveyed said that they agreed that Chile needed a new constitution. It may seem bizarre to have constitutional reform next to issues so material such as health and pensions. But a brief review of the characteristics of the Chilean constitutional system can illuminate why that position is not on after all. The Chilean constitution, as Bryce said, was designed, discussed, and implemented during Pinochet's dictatorship. Oh, can you put the slide. To paraphrase Jaime Guzman's unintended clarity, the plan was that the range of alternatives in the playfield was sufficiently reduced so that the political decision that resulted from it was not that different to the one we would desire. That is, if the opposition ever came into government, the field would be reduced so that the policy they would implement would not be that different to that of the dictatorship. The Constitution materialized this abstract aspiration through several mechanisms designed to perpetuate the dictatorship's legacy. Many of these mechanisms were reformed in Lagos's 2005 constitutional reform. To put it graphically, Pinochet himself had a life tenure in the Senate, a position he resigned in 2002, just to give you a little idea of how it worked. In 2005, the designated senators, along with other things, were eliminated from the Constitution, upon which politicians transversely claimed that the Constitution had been appropriated by the people. But even after that reform, several constitutional laws, to use Fernando Adria's framework, remained. These were the Leyes Orgánicas Constitucionales, the binomial system, and the Constitutional Tribunal. The Leyes Orgánicas Constitucionales refer to issues that would ordinarily be matters of law, but that the dictatorship decided in a special kind of law that requires 4/7 of both cameras in Congress to be modified. In practice, this implies that the heirs of the dictatorship's legacy have zero power over political decisions. The Leyes Orgánicas Constitucionales include matters such as the educational system, municipalities, the formation, financing, and regulation of political parties, and other important issues. The second block was the binomial system. This was an electoral system through which, in most circumstances, big political coalition. This system was replaced in 2013 by a proportional representation system, and the actual Congress was elected through this new system, and half of the Senate was too. The immediate result of this change was the rise of a new left political coalition, the Frente Amplio. But what is important to keep in mind about this is that a lot of the crucial political issues that were decided by the dictatorship were difficult to change because they required a high quorum. In addition to this, hard as it is to have 4/7 of any camera, it was nearly impossible with the binominal system because it was designed to have each camera with a 50-50 repartition. Now that the binominal system has been reformed, we have to see how much easier it gets to have to deal only with the 4/7 quorum. But first, we need to consider the third constitutional law. This is the Constitutional Tribunal. Well, the Constitutional Tribunal is a special tribunal different from the Supreme Court. It only sees a constitutional matter. It may declare a law unconstitutional preventively, that is, before it comes into existence. All of the leyes orgánicas constitucionales must go to the Constitutional Tribunal, and in addition, if members of the Cámara de Diputados or the Senate want to take a law to the tribunal, they may do so. In fact, they have done so several times throughout these 30 years. So, if a law is approved by both cameras, overcoming the supermajoritarian quorum before the binominal, not just that quorum, it would then have to survive the scrutiny of the Constitutional Tribunal, which, guess what, bases its decisions on the current Constitution. The Constitution, among other things, gives special protection to the right of property. This protection has been interpreted extensively to trump reforms in several areas, appealing to an immaterial right of property over contracts. For example, in the recent discussion about pensions, Feldmann, a prominent right-wing constitutionalist, wrote, "The Constitution is not sympathetic to the growth of the state." The discussion was about a state entity that would administer the additional 4%. And here he showed himself skeptic to the constitutionality of the project. The Constitution was really important too for Michelle Bachelet's reforms on her second government, and has been in several issues. So in addition to all I have mentioned, to modify the Constitution, that is the Constitutional Tribunal, or the binominal system, which has already been reformed, and the protection of the right of property, in either way is protected now, you need 2/3 of the total number of members of both cameras. Note that both of these quorums are not in respect of the members that attend a given session, but the total number of members of Congress. So it is very, very difficult. The result is that the default option, that is the policy implemented by the dictatorship, has a lot of power even today. In conclusion, the demand for a new constitution has something to do with the fact that there's a symbolic issue, right? The constitution was dictated by Pinochet. But more importantly, it has to do with the fact that people feel that it restricts the possibilities of political reform, because it has done so for 30 years. In the words of one of the protest chants of 2011 that still resonate today, let them come and see, this is not a government, it's just a bunch of laws from Pinochet. It is not far-fetched to imagine an alternative scenario in which, without the institutional laws and progressive reforms, the Chilean situation would not have reached this critical point. Of course, I'm not saying that it is all due to the Constitution, but it's important to understand the institutional laws to politics in Chile and how they have affected the political system. Thank you very much.
So we have many things on the table. I think everything from Higuera and the question of anomie, questions of criminal governance, the cutbacks in services, as the mental health reference kind of alludes to. Two questions of constitutional structure and whether or not there's just something inherently about the way in which the Constitution has been written and enforced that prevents the sorts of changes that might head off the sorts of violence and protests that we've seen here. There are many more elements, and many of you may have things to add to the discussion, and so what I'd like to do is open the floor, both for comments and for questions. If you choose to make a comment, I will be timing, and I will tell you when you've spoken for 3 minutes, so that we don't have, so that we're able to accommodate everybody who wants to speak. So please try to keep your remarks brief if you choose to do that.
about that as the Sebastian, or Piñera renuncia is obviously like Ricky renuncia. They're dealing with some of the same sort of neoliberal issues, and also issues from a government that they're inherited that, restricts the amount of reform that can happen. I wondered if you're seeing any sort of pan-Latin Americanism related to these issues, the way that these conversations are happening about the way neoliberalism has affected not just Chile, but many of the other countries or unfairly occupied territories.
Okay, just very briefly, I think that it has to do with the laundry list of things that Chileans are complaining about. Pensions, health, public transportation, education, our mobility, corruption, cost of living, and in general, I think unfair abusive practices. Part of it is in a way channeled against sort of more right-wing neoliberal regimes, but part of it are also rooted against governments like Venezuela or Bolivia. Okay, it's a way of governing that is unresponsive to people's main aspirations, and that in many ways people feel are unfair. Only this week we saw basically expressions of social upheaval and social explosion in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Haiti. So this is part of a broader movement. I think that, at least in my way of thinking, it's not just people have the temptation of just pointing at evil neoliberals that have ruined the world. I think that there's an element of both in which this is part of a larger sort of element of dissatisfaction with the way in which democracies work, which in the way authorities actually reacting to people's actual problems in general. That's my sense. In Puerto Rico is an example of that. The way in which basically the administration reacted to this natural disaster has been terribly inadequate and frankly cruel. It actually creates a lot of dissatisfaction. And then on top of that, adding insult to injury, the way in which the government was making fun of the way people were suffering. This is something intolerable.
Just a very quick thing to plant on the table is that, even if we think about the question of constitutional structure, it is so interesting that very similar sequences of events are happening in places that have entirely different structures of governance, right? So, if you think about Brazil, the 1988 Constitution has the opposite problems in a way from the Chilean Constitution. It includes everything. It has possibilities of all kinds of utopian dreams about distribution and the rest. And yet that is also not an adequate structure in many people's view to deal with people's day-to-day problems. So I think you're absolutely right that there are things that are just going beyond the individual circumstance of any one country that have to do with things that people can bring to the table. I don't know if anybody else has a direct response to this question before we move on to the next segment.
I have one comment following that one, which is, yeah, it's true, and maybe that's a reason to be. I'm not optimistic about what's happening, but maybe it is a reason to think of a different outcome. That actually the one who's paying the cost right now is a right-wing president and a right-wing constitution through this mobilizations. And also that the second thing, which is, you mentioned very briefly, which is sort of particular of the Chilean case, is that the economy was working so well. Like in a way, income distribution was diminishing, working so well under the sort of neoliberal trend. This is not a crisis of the economic system. It was not like the Dilma Rousseff inflation overboard, like a problem of the state not being able to meet ends meet, but actually well-balanced budget, sort of very little inflation, poverty reducing, huge inequality but diminishing, kind of not an overwhelming unemployment. So you could say it checked all the boxes of what they say, well, this is how the model is supposed to work. And not even that was enough to kind of contain it. So there's a deeper dissatisfaction. It's not just material issues. But there are material issues on the table, but it's how they're being administered and how they're being portrayed. There's a symbolic element to it too.
I think I have something. So on the surface, it was great. You have the highest HPI in the region. All the indicators, like level of poverty reduced from 40% to 10%. So on social indicators, on the surface, I think would be well. Then look at violence, for instance. The lowest, homicide rate in
individual kind of like entitlement to it. Like you have a right to, I have an entitlement to. But this movement, which is more amorphous, there is no head, there is no clear evident leader. Like it cries for dignity, which is kind of like the beauty of it and the difficulty, because what we make of that is what we'll see.
All right, I'm going to take 3 or 4 comments and then we'll come back to another round of responses. So I'll start with that. And please say who you are.
Yeah, I'm Mario Vanegas. I'm from Chile. I am a survivor of the coup in 1973. I'm a survivor of torture, and survivor having been in concentration camp for more than 2.5 years. And down here, I was expelled from Chile at the time that I was acting politically there after being detained. But I want to tell you, I'm just coming back from Chile 3 days ago. And I was present in all these, what I call the popular uprising, more than any other word that you have used to define what was the Chileans doing there during this day. I'm not going to go about all the details that you have mentioned here, but I just want to say that I really send a salute to the people in Chile for the courage that they have to participate in all these, manifestation, demonstration in the March of the 2 million people there, which is coming after 30 years. That's his slogan, 30 pesos is not the real reason, which was the increasement on the fare for the metro there, the public transportation. It's 30 years that they have been suffering there with left-wing government, or not left-wing, I see socialist government with Michelle Bachelet, with, well, I call him Richard Lake, Ricardo Lagos, and every other that have been president there in Chile, and the very right wing that we have today. But it's a problem with the system that was implanted in Chile, which came from here, the neoliberalism that not affect only, the economy, but the social and the political crisis that we are having now. And it has been terrible for 30 years that people have been supporting this. And they're tired, and they are angry, and they have reacted now in the way that you have seen. And probably will continue with this. Because the solution that the government finding, people are not happy with that. And they don't trust in the government, they don't trust in the political party, they don't trust in no one and in nothing at this point. And it's not just the young people. You would see in the demonstration, people all ages, families there participating. So we have to continue with this, trying to get a solution, which is very difficult, as you were saying, and everyone has been saying here. But I think we have to continue supporting the people in Chile in this struggle. The Chilean people are still manifesting. This morning, there was in Plaza Italia, which is the main square there in Santiago, they have about 20,000 people demonstrating today there, because they are not happy. One of the solutions they are finding is to have these popular assemblies, or cabildos as they call them, that they are discussing about what you're saying, the Constitution, changes to the Constitution. But it's going to be so difficult. And it's not that I am really pessimistic about it. It's just the reality that we have. That to find a solution, the political parties are involved. They have done nothing during this demonstration. They are not taking the leader of this, even the Socialist Party or the Communist Party that are there, because they are overcome with the whole situation of the population. So, but I call you really to continue having all these meetings, which is important in terms of education of what's going on there, because it's not that Chile. We have to understand that this neoliberal economy or political thing has been in all Latin America, and people now are awakening of that and are manifested at least everywhere. Especially with the country people, the peasants, with the original people like Mapuches in Chile, which have been totally destroyed for all these years. And they are struggling now, they are fighting that. I think that that's the most important thing, that we have to find a solution to that political, economic, and social crisis that we have in Chile. So let's continue with this. Really is important for us to participate.
Thank you. And I just want to call attention to one of the several things that came up that had not come up earlier, which is this question of trust and this question of whether it's possible to come to some kind of agreement about what is true and what is not, and what is desirable and what's expressive and what's not. And I hope that that'll continue to be a subject of conversation. All right, please.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Agustin Flau from Chile. I'm a PhD student at the school here. I wanted to make a super brief point about dissatisfaction and also economic social data, the government wasn't creating enough employment, and I think that could kind of explain what is going on.
Thank you. Let's see, somebody was the other side, in the red, yes.
I'm Owen, I'm from Valdivia, Chile, and something that I forgot your name, said earlier that really resonated with me. It's like, I'm from like a really small town, like in nowhere in Chile, and we're still mad there. Like my grandma can't live off her pension, so she has to like rent houses. We've been selling land and bleeding land because we don't have the money anymore to sustain our lifestyle, so we have to like sell off the things we had. And that's something that the government hasn't addressed, because like the older people in our family just didn't get any pensions for their work, and my grandma was a teacher, and she just can't live off that anymore. And that's something that the government really doesn't seem to want to address or hasn't addressed yet. And that's why some people, like even in the places that they don't talk about on the news, outside of Santiago, are still mad, which is something that, you know, we don't really talk about in news, because it's more flashy to talk about the big protests in Santiago and other capital places.
Thank you, that brings us back to Andreas' point about the national reach. Yes,
Sorry, I
Chris?
just didn't make sure you didn't miss me. So first of all, thank y'all for the space. My name is Gonzalo. I'm from Chicago. I want to piggyback a little bit off of Mario's comments. That I think that it's important to note. The brother earlier, you said something about the violence taking away from substantive criticism of the conditions in Chile. And similar to what happened here in Ferguson in 2014, I think if it wasn't for the violence that went down, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. This meeting wouldn't even have happened. So I think that to reduce it to not addressing substantive concerns, I think it leads us to a dangerous path. I think you also mentioned a few things having to do with the ideas of order and disorder, of looting, of unconstrained behavior, leading to fear. And I think that type of language creates false binaries of a good protester and a bad protester, of what looting is and what isn't looting. Because if you want to use those definitions, we can talk about the multiple multinationals that have been looting the south of Chile and Mapuche territories for decades. I think also going off the comment of Mario, the idea of neoliberalism that was born here in the University of Chicago, those ideas, it's not just an economic project, it's a political project. And so we have to take into account the role of mass media in Chile, the same way that we had Fox News over here, you know, criminalizing people that were just on the streets demanding substantive changes and distorting the message that was coming from the street. I think it's a folly to ignore the role of the mass media, both within Chile and outside of Chile, in terms of framing these kind of false binaries. And then also, just a comment from the street. I'm from Chile. I've had friends that have been sending me, you know, WhatsApp, the WhatsApp chats that are usually about BS are suddenly about, you know, I'm so sorry. And you know, and now those WhatsApp chats are about people being involved, about people saying, you know, what's up, homies? Let's go to the, you know, we're gonna go to the asamblea meeting in la Plaza Italia. Bueno, no dicen así, lo dicen más chino. Bueno, acá vamos para la Plaza Italia a cachar la reunión colectiva, ¿verdad? Entonces, what I do think is that I don't know about those theories of criminal governments and all that stuff. I'm not like familiar with those studies or those terms. But I think that if we are into psychoanalyzing, you know, the why that people are on the street in Chile, I think that we're heading down the wrong path, because I think it's clear to look at, again, not just the economic factors, but the political factors, as neoliberalism is a political project. And so I think that the revolts on the street should be considered uprisings, and they should be giving the level of legitimacy. And again, the false binaries, even with the Frente Amplio and the right-wing, you know, coalition, those are also false binaries that people have discovered that are false binaries, because at the end of the day, neither one of those coalitions have been serving the bottom. And I think that you see that in the protest signs, you see people saying, you know, ni de izquierda ni derecha, somos los de abajo. And I think that those are important points to consider.
Great. So let's take a round of responses from our panelists. And another point I think that came out from this, everybody's sort of bringing another thread into the conversation, But this idea of neither right nor left is another thing, going back to Laura's commentary, that I think we're seeing in a lot of places around the region and around the world, right? That there's not a proposal that is on the table that people are saying, no, this is the organized, top-down way of organizing things that is going to bring us forward. And what do we do in a world where the discontent is with that fact as well as with everything else? So responses from that.
So I'm gonna push back a little bit on the comments you made. On the one hand, saying that this is a matter of unemployment, the fact that unemployment is high, that's the reason we see this. And when you were saying that we are getting full primary, listen to the people. I'm not saying what I believe or what I say, just listen to the people and see what they are saying. The overwhelming majority of people are saying, we are against unfair practices, we are fed up with this, but we don't want violence. We want to keep on living peacefully and try to resolve this in a civilized, peaceful manner. Many people have been affected by this. It's taking them 2 to 3 hours to get to their jobs. Life is really difficult. Very sort of middle range enterprises don't know whether they're going to be able to pay salaries to pay their employees at the end of the month. It's not just that we're in a way looting a huge, chain. There were massive attacks against sort of little shopkeepers. There's one element that in which I do agree with you, which is the photo. The one I was looking at, I'm not an expert on this, but there's some things that need to be sort of underscored. The range of people and the symbol. It's not just that we're looting something because in many ways this is an important or relevant that I didn't have time to underscore. Unfortunately, this is also like part of the model. People have become so sort of very individualistic and very materialistic. That's part of what the model inoculated on people. And so they go, they loot, they don't see the small shop owner or the consequences that things might have. And at the same time, they're enraged. Many of these supermarkets have been sort of taking advantage of them, like having unfair practices against them, or in a way showing them what they cannot consume. So I take the point that some of that is sort of reflecting a lot of this sense of uneasiness and dissatisfaction. But again, I think that if we listen to what people are saying, they just want to live peacefully with more decent and better conditions. They just are fed up with the way of being treated in humiliating ways. And they don't want to be humiliated anymore.
But I would say also it's important to take into
I'm
account
sorry,
that
we can't have a back and forth because there are many other people who want to come in. So,
right,
but we can do that when we get another round. But I don't want to. There'll be time for that later. But I want to make sure that everybody's able to come in. Natalia, what's the next one?
Yeah, as someone who was in Chile last week, so I want to push back on this idea of the popular uprising with an evident solution. Like, there is a lot of shared discontent, and I would like it if there was a concrete left program, but I think that is not the case. As you said, they said ni de izquierda ni de derecha. I think one of the reasons why this movement has been so massive, different from the ones of education in 2006 and 2011, is because those movements had a head. So agreeing with the movement was, in some sense, agreeing with the solutions, right? Like in 2011, I want educación gratuita. But now, I mean, who could not agree that the pension system is broken and it's horrible? Who could not agree with the idea that hospitals work like crap? Sorry to use that, but like agreeing with that does not mean that we agree on the solution. So reading into this process like an evident political peaceful solution or like a popular uprising with an agenda, like a determined agenda, I think it's just like wishful thinking and not really addressing. Like, and I say that from Plaza Italia. I went to Plaza Italia. Like, I was in some of the protests, and that was my impression. Sadly, because I wish there was a needed agenda, but I think that was not the case.
All right, we have many other people with hands up, so I'm going to go to Ben first.
Thanks.
Please say who you are.
I'm Ben Lessing, and I'm a professor of political science at the University of Chicago. I want to thank the panel. It was really interesting comments that you both made. I kind of came here trying to figure out what was going on in Chile and why, and I'm still kind of a little bit confused about it. I mean, all the factors that have been put on the table make sense, but it's not clear to me why now and what was, why in this way, why so much violence, why is it, and what's being said, sort of all the things that have been said could have led to something at a different time, or could have easily not led to anything. It's not clear to me. Neoliberalism isn't new. The cage of neoliberalism we've been living in for 30 years. So why, 2019? Why, violence doesn't look like it's even uptaking. Sometimes it's not the level of violence, but how how much it changed, but that doesn't seem like it. One thing that resonated so far in the discussion was actually, your comments about like the WhatsApp chats. It brought me back to, when things were going down in Brazil. And suddenly, it was, instead of, hey, let's go get a beer, it was like, let's go, there's protests, let's go to protest. And protesting suddenly became, kind of fun in many ways, except you would get tear gas, but, it often was a thrill. And so the power of, that was sort of this, and that was kind of the time of, Istanbul was also going up, it sort of still, Arab Spring, so there's kind of a technological explanation maybe, like this is social media really, for the first time maybe in Chile, like protests breaking through on social media and the coordinating, which brings me to my question that I really want to ask, which is, I understand there's no leader, I understand there's no single set of demands, but the protests in Brazil were like that, and then they eventually they went on for a long time, and in some ways ended up kind of getting co-opted in different ways, in different places, and ultimately, I think, feeding into a lot of the protests that led to the impeachment of Feldman. And so even though, it was very sort of topsy-turvy, even though it began as sort of a progressive thing, it ended up very much feeding into overall dissatisfaction, anger against corruption, and eventually protesting and getting a president out of office, who at the end of the day was, from a left-wing party. So at the end of the day, it was very much a right-wing very much co-opted that protest process. So I want to know what is happening on social media, what role it plays, and whether that could be a channel for co-optation or the rise of a kind of a focus or a set of proposals, whether on the left or right or below.
I'll take a couple more comments, and then we'll have another reactions. In the back and the front.
Oh, yeah, so.
Please say who you are.
Yes, my name is Tristan. I would like to push on one comment that you said. We have all these index that say that Chile is right now a country that is doing well, right? We have the best socioeconomical index.
Human development.
Yeah, that one. But the thing at the same time, we have other indices that show that people in Chile are not happy. We have the highest, one of the highest suicide rate for young people among the OCDE countries. Many of the households that receive loans use those loans to buy basic things like food and to pay rent. The amount of antidepressants that Chileans are taking has steadily incremented across these years. The amount of obese people in Chile is one of the highest in the world. And so we have all this economic data that is not showing that actually people in Chile are more stressed and more frustrated than ever. Like, I feel like when I was in the university back there, all of my friends were stressed and unhappy. And I feel like this was a time bomb. Coming back to your comment about what are the reasons of this, is that, I mean, people in Chile are not happy, not at all. And I just think that this was natural, fine.
But that, of course, brings us back to Van Lessen's question, which is, this is a long-standing situation, right? And so what is it about this particular moment that brings it to the open? Dane, I don't know if you have an answer to that. Say who you are.
Dane Morris in the History Department here at Chicago. Right before Andreas Feldman compared this to the Caracazo, I was thinking, oh, this sounds a lot like the Caracazo. And then it made me realize, well, I don't really know that much about the Caracazo, and I can't make a reasonable comparison to these events, even with the little I know about the events in Chile now. But I would say two things in Chile that I don't think I remember from the Caracazo. One was, I was in Chile teaching in 2011, and the level of violence and, let's call it, sportive aimlessness of demonstrations then suggested a very high level of readiness to engage in structured violent protest without a clear purpose, even though that was a movement that was oriented around clear grievances and even oriented towards solutions. But another thing that does seem different and has come out in what people are saying is very different orientations for the future. than what I remember from Venezuela in the 1980s. And particularly consumer credit and student loan debt as anxieties, fears about the future in this way, fears about the pension system, which I don't think is happening. And then the issue of the easy magnification of calls to assemble because of social media making it possible to put together, quick sort of flash mob type demonstrations, but also to build recruitment for big events. So the surprise just doesn't seem to me to be on the order of magnitude of the Caracazo as a surprise in 1989. This didn't surprise me very much. Knowing what had happened in Brazil, seeing what's happened in Lebanon and what's going on in other places, I'm much less surprised, I think, than many of the people in this room are.
All right, let's have one more comment and then go on to a round of responses.
Hello, I'm Lisa. I'm Chilean, born and raised. I just wanted to comment something that hasn't been mentioned until now. The military occupation and the whole system of curfews that was imposed in Chile. I think the curfews were around for a week. I'm not sure, yeah, like a week around. And then the military took over the operations that the guerrilleros and the police couldn't handle. And then I think that's where the tone of the protest like shifted. People have a deep resentment for the military because of what happened in 1973. So there was a deep resentment for the military and police and military authority that just like came all out. So people started attacking the military, started attacking the guerrilleros. So there's this whole like shift between like, do we like authority because it's protecting us, or do we resent authority because of all the human rights violations that they did before and that they're doing now?
And that's, I'm so glad that you brought that up because, of course, another strain of the conversation that we haven't gone into very deeply is how not just in Chile but also elsewhere in Latin America, this sort of spectrum of a real authoritarian order that takes neoliberalism to a whole different dimension, right, has begun to become a possibility in Chile as elsewhere. And so, and it does change the way that people think about questions of borders. The responses from our panelists, and then we'll do another round of comments.
Easy responses. The question of Ben's question is always a very good one. Why now? It's impossible to know, but I do agree with some of the things that Dane was saying, that we had a lot of indicators that something was going for a long time. I mentioned, or I showed like the looting in 2010. It was an antecedent to this. And then not only that, protests, sports events, exceedingly violent oftentimes, many activities, protests, the whole crisis of the Instituto Nacional, which is based on the emblematic school in Santiago, that's been sort of in a way paralyzed by very dramatic levels of violence and mishandling and clumsy handling of our authorities and the like. And again, I would in a way echo what Dave was saying. Unfortunately, there's a multifaceted type of structure. Chile is in a way showing, unfortunately. I mean, you see this, and you see very low homicide rates, and the police sort of working. And when we look at these discussions of criminal counseling, it's not ever part of it. But it's a very violent society, unfortunately. It's a very violent society. And concerning, and I want to tie this to what you mentioned, the whole thing about the military, to me that is in a way a really interesting indicator of how traumatized Chile is about 73. We are traumatized collectively. In many ways, I think, in my sense, is that the reading of saying because they deployed the army, the violence went out of control, I just don't see that happening. I think I see the other way around. Violence was absolutely out of control. The police wasn't able to handle. So it was responsible about. And I never voted for the right. Okay, I'm not someone who's really eager. I work on human rights. I have 20 years of work in this matter, and I can give you a whole display of criticism about how the police works in Chile. But honestly, given that situation, it would have been irresponsible not to deploy the army. Okay, so rather counterfactual. If we had the kind of situation we had with the army, imagine how it would have been without the army. Okay, but once you make that decision, you are between a rock and a hard place because the army is not trained
to try to prevent this. It doesn't have the equipment, so they don't have any gear to repress. So either shoot or they deter. And what we saw was really interesting. People were not afraid of the military. They were sort of shouting at them, insulting them, telling them, "Milico de mierda, muérete," in their face. Okay, that didn't happen in '73. You would not do that. You wouldn't dare to do that. So this is basically a situation in which you see disproportionate force or human rights violations in a totally different stage, in a totally different context. It's basically a democratic post-Cold War context in which the animal is different. Okay.
What about the torture center underneath the Baquedano train station?
This has to do with basically general patterns of police brutality that have been documented for 20 years in Chile.
A secret detention center?
Yeah.
That's not a remnant of the military?
We have to really investigate on that, really.
It's documented.
Well, let's see
Women being raped.
let's see what the fact-finding mission of the UN, which is basically a neutral arbiter, says about that. If they find that, then you're right. Now I think we don't have antecedents to say something like that. Okay? In terms of
But the acquaintance of the violence against the police that are fully armed and people that are out there with sticks and stones at most, I think is also, again, the idea of framing it in a way
There
that.
are many people who are here, and everybody has a perspective.
We're just having a
And I would like to allow the conversation to go forward so that everybody has a chance.
Right, but we're talking
Natalia's-
about the idea of
it
armed
was-
military
we
police,
can talk
ministerial
about that- We
armed.
can talk about that later, but right now it's Natalia has.
we can talk about that later. Okay?
Thank you. About why today, I think the technological explanation is not really convincing because in 2011 we also had that technology, so that doesn't seem convincing to me. I think maybe Piñera had something to do like this. The ministers the past months have been saying some things that were really upsetting for the population. For instance, when they decided to raise the subway fare, the Minister of Economy said like, "Oh, but if you wake up earlier, we'll give you a cheaper price." And that was really upsetting because it was like, you know what, I travel 2 hours to go to work, and I wake up at 6 in the morning or 5, and you want me to wake up earlier, and like it's my fault. So I think maybe that can be sort of the catalyzer for this. I just wanted to add to the comment of the military. I absolutely agree that it has like a very symbolic. I don't know if it made it worse, it made it better, but it's also difficult because the military actually has a very good pension system, with solidarity, and a very good health system. So it's also kind of outrageous for the population that the militaries that came out in the '73 are coming out again, and they are the ones who have a good pension and a good health, which is all we're asking for. So I think it's, just to add to your comment, like, I see what you're going to, like, I agree partially, but also I don't know why that is so distinctive about Chile. A lot of those issues are common, like the use of antidepressants, of obesity, or like the global trend. It is true that it is higher in Chile, in obesity in particular, but the other issues, I don't see them being that different, so I think it still leads to the question like why now.
So we have about 15 minutes left, so I'm going to take another round of comments, especially from people who are having, and then we'll go back to people who want to jump back into the conversation. Well, if Juan's the one who stand up, that's where we'll go.
I should have said that I'm also Chilean, people representing themselves, given their birth certificates, but. Yeah, I think there's an issue there with the military not only having an excellent pension system. In fact, 1% of Chile's GDP goes into the military pension system, which is just outrageous, and it's by far the largest item on the budget, like military pensions. But also, I think one thing that was clearly different about why people are not afraid of the military anymore, I think the police and the military have lost a lot of respect lately in Chile. It's true there's a trauma of the '73, but actually when you see the general trends of the institutions that are best evaluated by the population, military and the police were consistently the best evaluated institution in Chile, systematically, which is, for me, an incomprehensible thing, but it was there. And then the corruption scandals, which in a lot of countries have affected the political class. In this case, they spilled over in a sort of amount that made the political scandals pale into the military and the police taking money out of the state funds and just using them for personal profit. And that combined with the sort of like the killing of Vanegas in South and then intent to erase proof of that killing. I think that those things are coming together in a way that more than ever in this protest, not unlike 2011, like 2006, the military and the police are at the lowest in terms of the respectability that the population have for them. So it was normal to see in sort of confrontations between the people and the police, a lot of people doubting it, like wanting this, like the sort of discourse of the peaceful confrontation, like no, we want peaceful protest, but when you start hitting the police, that's too much, because the police is a good institution and it's well evaluated. Now it was the police, now what you're seeing constantly is this conspiracy theories of the police started the burnings of the subway, the police have this torture centers, which I'm not saying they're false or true, it's just that sort of the media, the social media specifically, have gone really hard on the police and the military as faking the entire movement and faking the violence, and that the looting is actually being done by the police and that the burning is actually being done by the military. And I think 5 years ago, it would have catch ground. Like people wouldn't have believed. I don't think people would have believed it as easily as now. People say, well, you know what? The police, now that they saw them kill a Mapuche person and then erase the camera, and then this person, I don't know if I believe the police anymore when they say they didn't start the fight. So there's a whole. There were like a last bastion of what you can believe. If a policeman tells you he didn't do it, you will believe him at some point. And even in military trials and in criminal trials, the declaration, it's nowhere written in the law, but the declaration of a policeman that he saw the person was proof enough. And now people just don't, I believe, don't trust the military or the police anymore. And that has given another element to this protest, which has explained why it has been so hard to control in a way. In the way it was usually controlled.
Let's see if there's anybody else who wants to jump in, and then we'll. Is there anybody else who?
Just like very brief. I just want to reflect back before we go. Like, I don't have a clear sense of where this is going. I know you pointed to a couple of potential outcomes, but what's going to push this in one way or the other? Is there a political force that can swoop in and at least make some hay out of all of this, or not, either on the left or the right or from below? Are there reforms that could, where do you see this going?
Before resolution, which is what you laid out, it could be, my real concern is that it's hard to see how institutions can really channel this in a reasonable way, because I think they are in a way overwhelmed. Institutions are not reacting. You were telling about the police, for instance, and that's what ties with your work on criminal violence. The Chilean police have had a reputation of being very brutal, very repressive, but for the most part quite honest. But what we're seeing now is that they're brutal. In addition to that, they're corrupt. They're being bought. There's connivance between them and some narco trafficking organizations. You're seeing this more and more and more. So Chile is becoming more normal. That regional pattern. Then something is very telling. We haven't spoken about this. I mean, something very conspicuous is silent on the Catholic Church. Absolutely. I mean, they cannot say anything. What are they going to say? Nobody believes. Unfortunately, I'm not Catholic, so I shouldn't say that. But I'm Jewish, so I shouldn't be saying this. But the thing is that there's total disbelief in the Catholic Church. The Church is absolutely silent. And this is something unheard of in a situation of such a dire crisis. And the Catholic Church, the moral fiber of the country, is not saying anything. And they cannot say anything because they are terrified. What are they going to say? People don't believe in that. It's the midst of a major crisis. So I don't see a lot of institutional challenges the way take this in a more sort of political. The solution to this is political. People, the government or any other sort of authority is not going to make up 30 or 40 years of a model that has created this level of dissatisfaction. So basically this has to do with the office and symbols. And that's what, in my way of thinking, the administration has been so clumsy. This has to do with ways in which we are showing, hoping that the changes are coming. They're not going to come immediately, but they're showing the right direction. And we haven't seen anything of the sort. And unfortunately, the opposition is sort of reacting in ways that is very opportunistic. And doing things that in a way bring shame to the government, but not saying, well, how do we contribute to trying to solve the situation that is so bad?
So we're losing people to 1:30 classes, but if anyone else wants to jump in and say anything before we break, I'd like to give a chance. So, yes, please.
I wanted to ask one question about how both, think how reliable the indicators that we're basing our judgments on actually are. So we just say poverty in Chile is much lower than the rest of Latin America, and also the violence is much lower. So as we touched on, there's areas in Santiago where we're not really measuring violence, where there's sort of violence under control. I don't know if you think it's still captured by the figures we're dealing with, or in terms of poverty, we think poverty is quite low in Chile, but we also know that around 50% of Chileans make minimum wage or just above minimum wage, which to me sounds like near poverty. So is it really that these factors are so these economic factors are as strong as we thought they are, or they're being misportrayed in a way where I feel like the government puts the line, the poverty line is being lower than it is, higher than it should be?
Yeah, I can respond to that. I don't think they're so much being misportrayed as when altered, but the thing is that they don't reflect what we used to think they reflected. For example, the 10%, like the richest 10% of Chile, if you're a single living person, you earn 700,000 pesos, and like you pay, for example, 300,000 for university, so like with 400,000 pesos, it's really difficult to live with that. You're in that richest 10%, which puts you like on the same scale as Sebastián Piñera or Mate or Lux, which are, and like really with 700,000 pesos for a single person, like it's difficult to live in Chile, and you're the richest 10% of the population. It's just that compared with other countries, it is true that your power to buy things is bigger, but then you have to strive with your own, we say, con tus propias uñas, for pensions, for health. So like in the end, yeah, you have numbers, but you don't really have access to quality services. And so I don't think it's a problem of the statistics, but the problem is that we're not reading them to what they really represent. Yes, please.
So the thing is that I'm Chilean, by the way, and you see, for example, if you see how the G is built for the as a survey, all it has self-reported data, and the issue with the self-reported data in high-income people is high-income people don't report the income, and it's difficult to contact them. So basically, the Gini is higher than the one that you see in the picture. On the other hand, if you see the poverty studies, is measured as an absolute line, and you can basically
reflect. Neoliberalism is very dismissive of people, I think, the way that it's enacted. And so I'm not surprised when there was a catalyzing force that, people came from all over. And your example that they were just told, well, get up a little earlier, you're being acted upon. Your water is privatized.
They didn't even follow the neoliberal principles, so supposedly it was sort of free market competition, and then they fixed prices. So that's the thing. At the end of the day, even Friedman would be against that, because it wasn't really working the way he envisioned it to. At the end of the day, it was basically the greed of this huge conglomerate that was basically, making the best for themselves at the expense of anyone else. And I think that's when you look at the stage, the huge longer list of, reivindications and grievances that you have, has to do with that. The fact that oftentimes they were humiliated, that everything was, in a way, it created sort of an abusive relationship between companies and the people. And not only that, also this sense of impunity, that people, the ones who were really, making profit of this or benefiting from this, living in a different country. The rules didn't apply in the same way. Taxes didn't apply in the same way. So everything was, in a way, biased towards the overwhelming majority of people. So one can see where all this comes from. But at the same time, what is really mystifying is that when you look at all the indicators, nobody's manipulating them. They're for the most part really, accurate. And yes, poverty has been really dropped enormously, and income and the like. So it's a symbol of our times. Our societies are more complex now. We're sort of looking at things from the 1960s and 70s, and sort of thinking also in a romanticized way that things in the 60s and 70s were wonderful when they weren't. Okay, they were, honestly. So it is a challenge, and again, my sense, we need to be measured about this, and we cannot in a way say everything that was brought by this model is wrong.
So now we have to redo it again, which is what, the region has been doing historically. So we pass from, all the way from Marxism to neoliberalism, then we discard everything about ISI because we think it's not working. The solution is something measured in between, in which you correct the things that don't work and you build on the ones that really work. But again, without this measure of sort of saying this hasn't really worked in the ways we conceive, this has created conditions for some people to benefit unfairly, and this hasn't really. We need to correct the pillars of how the structure of society works. Without doing that soul search, saying this is an unfair society, and the people are reacting to that. Without doing that, soul searching in a measured way, thinking about it, we are going to end up going all the way to the tender of God knows where, and we're going to begin from scratch again. And I don't think anyone wants that. But if we don't pay attention, that's exactly what's going to happen, unfortunately.
We have exactly 3 minutes, and we had another hand here. I think this was, as a historian who studies Chile, the word moderation is a very important word in Chilean history. But perhaps we'll end with another perspective. But we do have a hard ending at one point.
Gotcha. No, what I was trying to say earlier was this idea that when we talk about the damage to private property and the loss of human lives in the same sentence, again, a false duality. I think when we talk about the idea of injuries to soldiers that are armed to the teeth with weapons, and the injuries of protesters that have rocks and stones, I think, again, is a false binary. And also taking a step back, I think that we're at 1973 again. The reason why neoliberalism comes into play as an economic political project, as I'm sure most of you all know, was because capitalism was in crisis at the time. And I think that we're in a shift now where the U.S. has to adapt to a multipolar world. And the reason that we're seeing a lot of U.S. manipulated uprisings, right? Because in the U.S. we're hearing about Hong Kong and Venezuela protests, but we don't hear about the protests in Ecuador and in Chile. And there's a reason for that, because the ones in Chile don't benefit the U.S. geopolitical interests. So I think that it's also something to take into account that right now, even for the people, the ruling class, even for the oligarchy within Chile, neoliberalism is not working for them anymore either. And so when you talk about the shift that's coming, I think it's important to put that into play, and even the conversations about technology and the shift that's occurring to a digital monopoly capitalism, I think is important to look at in order to not, again, make these false binaries and order for who.
All right, so I think we are in some ways where we began. This is a situation in much flux. I think we all have some similar ideas, some common threads. Certainly the thread of not knowing what institution or what set of ideas to trust, I think, is one that virtually everybody who spoke comes back to, right? That you don't trust neoliberalism, but you also don't trust the Constitution, and you don't really have a way of sort of thinking about what this next phase is going to be. And I think that's the question before all of us, not just in Chile and elsewhere. These are protests against many things. What are they protests for? And that, I think, is a question that we were not